You're listening to Radio VoR, the voice of Russia, from London. Later this year, voters in Scotland will face something of an existential question: to be or not to be an independent state, that is. Alex Salmonds' governing Scottish National Party, in what might be described as the longest referendum campaign in history, has been making its case for independence. The Better Together campaign, including Conservatives, Liberal Democrats and Labour, among others, have been making their case against. And in the run-up to that vote, Radio VoR is holding a series of discussions examining some of the key arguments in the debate. Today, we're looking at the business and economic case with a panel of experts, looking not so much at what the SNP or the Better Together campaigns say, but rather how their claims stand up. What would the impact of a yes vote for independence be on Scotland's economy and those of the UK and the EU? I'm joined here in the studio in London by Dr. Steve Davies. He's the Education Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Petros Fasoulis is Chairman of the European Movement UK, or Euromove. From Brussels, I'm joined by Catherine Staylor. She's a Labour MEP for Scotland. From Edinburgh, Ivan McKee is Director of Business for Scotland. He joins the discussion from there. Andrew Hughes-Hallett is Professor of Economics at the University of St Andrews. He's also on the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisers. Welcome to you all. Clearly a lot to get through in this whole debate, but on this question of the economy, I think this is one of the key things that is going to determine how this debate unfolds. Steve Davies, why don't we start with you? Has the Scottish Government, in its white paper on economics and in the general candour of the debate about what they've said about economics, have they made the case?
Well, they have in a way, but I think they've left a lot out. In fact, I think things that would redound to their benefit, actually. I do think that Scottish independence would benefit Scotland economically, but mainly because it would force the Scottish Government, whichever party that might be, to confront problems that they are able to avoid so long as they're part of the United Kingdom, particularly the catastrophic social problems they have in Greater Glasgow, basically. And they haven't actually made that case. I mean, Alex Salmond has made the general case, which I think is correct, that it would give the Scottish Government greater powers to make its own decisions, adopt its own economic policies and things of that sort. But they haven't really, I think, spelt out what I think is actually quite a strong case on their side. They also haven't really addressed the, I think, very important question of monetary policy and whether or not Scotland should have its own currency after independence, which I think they probably should do, but that's something they've deliberately avoided addressing.
Currency, definitely one of the questions that we're going to get into in a bit more detail. But Ivan McKee, let me just come to you and ask you just generally, what impact is the independence debate having on business and investor confidence in Scotland?
I think that we've seen evidence that it's actually driving up the levels of inward investment into Scotland. A lot of people looking at this from outside Scotland and the UK recognise the fact that Scotland is a wealthy country and it will generate a new lease of life and opportunities for business investment following the yes vote this year. And there was a Ernst & Young report came out last year. Scotland yet again was the second highest area in the UK after London for inward investment. That level had increased on the previous year, and the Ernst & Young report made the point of saying that was actually the fact that there was a referendum it wasn't hampering investment, it was actually encouraging it.
When we look at essentially how to sort of calculate the cost of divorce, which is essentially really what we're looking at in this debate, the UK government came out and said it would in all circumstances honour all UK debt. Andrew Hughes-Hallett, that's a pretty crucial lifeline to Alex Salmond, wouldn't you say?
Well, I don't know if it's crucial, but it's certainly helpful. It would,
yes.
The interest payments on that debt, if that arrangement were reached, would amount to a saving of somewhere between 3 and 5, depending on how you calculate it, £1 billion a year. So that would basically put the budget into a small surplus. So it would be very helpful from that point of view. But the fiscal position is relatively, and I emphasize the word relatively, strong compared to the rest of the UK and indeed most of Europe to start with. So it's not a deal breaker. It's very helpful. I think to a large extent they are obliged to do that because the legal position is that Scotland is not obliged to accept the debt in any case. It can voluntarily do so if it wishes, and may well do so if that produces a more satisfactory and cooperative conclusion to the whole thing. But that's for the government to negotiate, and both governments to negotiate if they agree to parcel out the debt in some way. That's not been done. So it's very helpful.
Could I just add there, we do have some historical precedents for this kind of bargaining and negotiation with Czechoslovakia breaking up, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and also even before the treaties that Andrew mentioned, the separation of Norway from Sweden. There is a kind of set of precedents to go on, but it's ultimately a pragmatic decision. Part of the problems, by the way, is there's a legal instrument attached to the existing debt, which you can't simply tear up and reissue, and that's why there's no legal obligation for an independent Scot to take on the existing debt.
Catherine Staylor, let me bring you in here. There's a perception of almost negativity surrounding the No campaign. I mean, that's what some on the yes side have said, and scaremongering. Simple fact of the matter is, when you compare Scotland's economy to that of other smaller European nations, it compares quite favourably, doesn't it? I mean, there's no question that Scotland could form an independent economy if it so wished.
Well, it will be determined by the Scottish people what they decide on the 18th of September, and none of us can predict
Absolutely
that outcome. But I think, contrary to what Ivan was saying, the businesses I speak to are deeply fearful about independence and the uncertainty that would cause. And this rosy picture that Ivan paints, I think, is far from the reality. I mean, firstly, we don't know which currency we would have. Secondly, the debt issue, the reason the UK has come in is because of the uncertainty issues that they feel that they have to address by saying they will secure that. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty there, and that's why I prefer being part of one of the most successful unions and one of the most successful single markets, which is the UK, and also through our membership of the UK, being part of the European Union and the single market that we have access to of 500 million citizens.
The EU is a good question, Petros, to bring you in on. There's absolutely no certainty at all, is there, about what would happen in the event of Scotland becoming independent vis-à-vis its EU membership. The EU is Scotland's biggest trading partner, and it's not clear if it would be a member of the EU. How would that work in your view?
Well, first of all, talking about economics, and as Catherine mentioned, membership of the European Union is paramount for most European nations, especially those that are smaller or medium-sized. And for that reason, I think it will be important in the context of the conversation to consider what membership arrangements there will be. As you correctly pointed out, it's not guaranteed that Scotland will be a member of the European Union. Senior officials and other member states have made comments to that effect. Having said that, I would find it difficult to imagine a situation where Scotland would be denied entry to the European Union. It fulfills all the possible criteria, and it's indeed a very popular nation among our European neighbours. So it would be very unlikely that Scotland will be delayed.
But it would take time. It would be a process rather than a sort of immediate... Scotland is somehow a successor to the UK's membership of the EU.
Indeed. There are plenty of legal complications to consider here, not least the considerations of member states who have to deal with similar successionist movements in their own territory, and they wouldn't like to set a precedence in that context.
You're listening to Radio VoR, the voice of Russia from London. I'm Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing the economic case for Scottish independence with my guests, Dr. Steve Davies, Petros Fasoulas, Catherine Staylor, Ivan McKee, and Andrew Hughes Hallett. Ivan McKee, I mean, a lot of what we're hearing here would seem to not contradict, but it would sort of complicate the picture that you were painting of Scottish business. I mean, why would I, as an investor, choose this moment to put money into Scotland when the political uncertainty in the country is such?
Well, in terms of that point, if you're a smart investor, you buy when you get a good price in anticipation of it going up, and the Scottish economy after independence is going to take off. I mean, the reality is, just to pick up on a few points, as someone mentioned already, Scotland's fiscal position is far superior to that of the UK on a whole. Scotland's got a GDP per head 18% higher than the UK average. Our tax take per head is £1,700 per head higher than the UK average. At the moment, all of that gets sent south, and then some of it, our pocket money, small change, gets sent back north to run services. When Scotland's independent, clearly that the financial position will be much, much stronger from a public finance point of view, and that will help drive the economy forward. In terms of the currency, I think there's two people have said there's uncertainty on the currency. There's absolute 100% certainty on the currency, and the people from the No campaign that say there isn't are basically either, they know the facts and all they're doing is guilty of scaremongering and creating uncertainty.
Catherine Staylor.
Sorry, the Welsh have even said and come out that Scotland in a sterling, union would create instability. There's real issues around
Absolutely.
Ivan, and we can't avoid that. It may be that in the white paper Alex Salmond asserts this. That doesn't mean to say it happened.
There is no uncertainty around about it.
Oh, come on, Ivan.
That's just a simple question, Catherine. In the event of Scottish independence, what currency would the rest of the UK want Scotland to use?
Well, that's actually an open question, because the problem for an independent Scotland is that if they continue to use sterling, but sterling is still controlled and issued by the Bank of England, they're in the same position. They're in a monetary union where they have no control over their own currency policy, which is I would think rather strange for an independent country, but also very dangerous. The Eurozone and its experiences have shown us how risky it can be to be in a currency union when you're not in an optimal currency area. And it's not clear to me that the British Isles are an optimal currency area without a single government.
First of all, sterling's a fully tradable currency, so there's absolutely nothing that stops you using it anyway. Secondly, sterling's an asset of the UK. In Scotland, it's as much Scotland's currency as it is the rest of the UK's currency. So if Scotland isn't, if the rest of the UK isn't willing to give Scotland a share of the Bank of England, then Scotland clearly isn't in a position to take on the liabilities.
Catherine Staylor, let me bring you in there. How would you respond to that?
Well, what I would say to Ivan is that the uncertainties are clearly there. He may make that assertion that's in the white paper, and clearly that is what the nationalists would like. That doesn't mean to say it would happen. All indications are that at the moment we have sterling, we are part of the United Kingdom with a secure currency, and the nationalists are putting that in jeopardy. So I think we have to be very clear here. There is no guarantee that we will be able to have sterling after independence, and I think we need to be, a little bit. I'm not scaremongering, Ivan. I'm just trying to.
Yes, you are. Sterling's a fully tradable currency. I am not
scaremongering, Ivan. I'm just putting over a perspective which you, as somebody who supports the nationalists, do not like to hear. And I think at the end of the day, people in Scotland. Already I have constituents writing to me to say, will they be able to have ISAs? What happens to other and you're kind of looking at it going, I think that it's in Scotland's national interest that we remain part of a strong United Kingdom and a full membership as a large member state of the European Union.
Well, Andrew Hughes-Hallett, let me bring you in on this question of the currency. Let's, if we can, divorce it from the sort of party politics on a pure economics level. How would it work if Scotland were to retain sterling? Because, as has been said, Scotland would presumably not be represented on the Bank of England. I mean, there's no reason to assume that the Bank of England would have a Scottish representation on the Monetary Policy Committee. So how would it work?
Talking about monetary union, Scotland is already in a monetary union with sterling right now. It's what's called a unilateral monetary union because Scotland doesn't have any direct influence on the decisions which are taken, other than through its MPs who are in a minority as well. That's different from a multilateral monetary union, which is what the Eurozone is, where each country has a representative in the central bank for taking decisions. So it's not as if you were going to go into a new monetary union, and one would imagine that the multilateral monetary union would be the better of the two if you can achieve it. But that's simply because it means that more people get to make decisions, and therefore if you have more decision-making power, you can usually get a better outcome. On the other hand, if you say you want the same fiscal rules on the UK government in London, because of course you realise that Scotland is far more vulnerable to problems and mistakes made in London than London is ever vulnerable to problems and mistakes made in Scotland. So it has to be both-sided, even if you've got a voting imbalance, as it were. You're not 50-50 each. By the way, the ECB is one person, one vote in the council there. So if you took that model, a smaller Scotland would still have one vote compared to the rest of the UK. One vote, or if the UK wanted to devolve the Bank of England's activities, there'd be more votes. So it's perfectly possible to have all of these arrangements. It's a question of what can be negotiated and what people are prepared to live with.
I actually think, personally, that the best option would indeed be for Scotland to have its own currency. I mean, as Andrew says, you could have the existing situation. The problem is you wouldn't control your own monetary policy, but then arguably you don't know anyway. The other alternative is, as he says, you have a multilateral agreement, but given the relative size of English the English economy and population compared to Scotland, I think it's quite clear who would be in the driving seat. And as Andrew says, that would require fiscal rules and enforcement as well, which would mean an independent Scottish government losing control of its own fiscal policy, which surely defeats the whole object of independence, I'd have thought.
Petros Fasoulis, I mean, this debate is being keenly watched in Europe as well, isn't it? Because, I mean, obviously it has an impact on potentially other separatist movements there, the Basque question, etc. But, I mean, how would Scottish independence actually be, how would European capitals react to it? How would Brussels react to that, do you think?
That's probably the million-dollar question. As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of goodwill towards the Scots in Brussels, both within the institutions and by fellow member states. There is appreciation of what Scotland can bring on the table. As part of the United Kingdom, it has contributed in the process of integration, and people will welcome that contribution going forward.
But presumably with London perhaps potentially leaning on them to not be overly favourable.
I have the feeling that London will find it difficult to create complications for Scotland. There are other member states that will be more keen to make Scotland's life difficult. It won't be London. But the fact of the matter remains, because the area is grey legally, and the institutional makeup and the institutions of the European Union are not in a position to take a definite answer on this. The question of the single currency, I think, is important in that context too. New member states that join the European Union have a legal obligation to join the single currency once they meet the criteria, and the Scottish economy will probably be able to fulfil that criteria fairly easily. So there is a possibility that part of the package that will be offered to Scotland, if it reapplied for membership, will be one that will imply eventual membership of the single currency. So that should also be part of the conversation, not least because the Eurozone is integrating to such an extent that smaller member states especially consider it important to be in it while the architecture is being formed. And I have the feeling that people in Holyrood will consider membership of the Eurozone. The current complications and problems in some parts of the Eurozone have spooked people. They don't want to openly talk about it. But if you look at the legal requirements, at least in the economic dimension, membership of the Eurozone will be on the agenda for Scotland.
And you're being terribly diplomatic there, but when you say other states in the EU, you're referring presumably to Spain? Or
Belgium is also a country that has its own issues. France, indeed. It won't be straightforward.
Let's move on to this question about tax and the tax regime. Ivan McKee, what do you think Scotland could and should do with tax if it were to become independent? Because, of course, the Scottish Parliament already has tax-varying powers now, which it hasn't used.
I mean, to be clear, the tax-raising powers that the Scottish Parliament has at the moment are minuscule. They're really the rules that constrain what they can and can't do make it effectively worthless. They've got very, very small latitude income tax, but that would then reduce the pocket money they get from London. Whereas if you're an independent country, you've got control of those resources. At the moment, Scotland generates almost 10% of UK tax and only receives just over 9% of UK spending. So it's quite a significant imbalance. But when you calculate that through, it comes to about £4.5 billion or £800 per person. So an independent Scotland's got quite considerable latitude to make investments where it makes sense, and that includes investments in realignment of the tax system. Now, the White Paper has indicated two things which are going to substantially help business. One is a reduction in corporation tax or to 3% below the current UK level. And secondly is a reduction in air passenger duty, which will go a long way to support connectivity between Scotland, the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. I mean, Scotland's airport traffic is far, far below that of comparable countries like Denmark or Norway at the moment, as a consequence of the fact that the UK government favours traffic policies, airport policies from the southeast of England. So there's quite a lot of things already in the White Paper that are going to help business on the tax front. As I say, Scotland, its current financial position means it's well able to afford that, whereas at the moment it can't.
Steve Davies, there's a real opportunity here for an independent Scotland, isn't there? Because it could come out with a completely favourable tax regime vis-a-vis the rest of what remains of the rest of the UK. It could, in fact, actually end up taking business from the rest of the UK.
This is absolutely true. This is one of the reasons why I think actually independence would, on balance, given the right decisions, be a good deal for Scotland. There's actually quite a lot of work by economists, notably a chap called Andrew Zalesina, which shows that smaller countries are typically better run and better in terms of their fiscal policy than large ones for various reasons. And a Scottish government would have scope to do all kinds of things that would actually attract business, restore its public finances, make the economy much more dynamic. I mean, I, for example, would favour them getting rid of corporation tax completely. And I think there'd be enormous advantages to a first adopter of that kind of radical measure. And they'll certainly need to do something because, as I said earlier, the really big problem facing any Scottish government is the fact that while most of Scotland is doing okay or even quite well, they have this severe social problem in what you might call loosely Greater Glasgow. And that's what they need to do. And I think if it's the Edinburgh taxpayer who's paying for that, rather than the taxpayer of the UK as a whole, then the pressure to do something about the social problems there is going to become much more intense, which is good.
Catherine Stahler, let me bring you in there. I mean, on this question of tax and more broadly fiscal policy, is there an opportunity or is there a danger from your perspective that Edinburgh could actually sell the debate based purely on those plans?
Well, I think there's enough figures from the Institute of Fiscal Studies that say Scotland contributes $56.9 billion to the UK tax pot and receives $63.5 billion in UK spend, which means that there's some sort of deficit in $6.6 billion. So I would really question Ivan's little statistics there about how successful. And even if he took the oil issue, which is what they think will fill the shortfall, we still got $3.3 billion in shortfall. So my question I just think there's a hole in the SNP's economic plans here. And I think, we're right to I think it was Steve Davis has talked about the social challenges we face. I often think that the SNP's plans, they want a low corporate tax base, reducing it by 3%, but they want a Norwegian social model. Those figures just do not add up.
That is true.
You have to actually look at what we get at the moment. I think we get a good deal at the moment, and I think we are stronger as part of the United Kingdom as a large member state. This idea that as a small member state we have the same influence, for example, in the European Union, I think is quite wrong. I think we have a great influence as a large member state within the European Union. And going back to the European Union question that was mentioned previously, I mean, the SNP claim that we can somehow have a speedy process. And remember, I pursued the SNP government about their claims about automatic membership of Scotland in the European Union, and we even went to the Court of Session on that question. And now we see that in the White Paper there's this fast-stream process under an Article 48, which the guardians of the Treaty European Commission have completely dismissed, that would have to be an Article 49 procedure, which is an accession procedure. So there's so much uncertainty. The best interest for Scotland is to remain part of the United Kingdom and as that part of the European Union.
This is Radio VR, the voice of Russia, coming to you live from London. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia from London. I'm Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing the economic case for Scottish independence with my guests Dr. Steve Davies, Petros Fasoulas, Catherine Stahler, Ivan McKee, and Andrew Hughes Hallett. Ivan McKee, there is a problem here, isn't there? I mean, Alex Salmond does talk about many things which seem to have changed over time. I mean, he used to talk about the arc of prosperity. Well, he doesn't talk about that anymore, given what happened in Iceland. He used to talk about the euro. Well, he doesn't talk about that anymore. There is, some would say, this black hole in the numbers. Can you have all of these things simultaneously? Is there enough detail there?
Wow, a few things to go through. First of all, I just want to make the point that the Yes campaign is much, much wider than the SNP. There are many other people involved in it. I've got nothing to do with the SNP. I'm non-party political. The Greens are in there, Socialists, there's people on the right. There's a large section of the Labour Party are pro-independence as well. So there's a lot more than the SNP involved in this. I think it's a typical tactic of the No campaign to paint it as some kind of SNP only situation. In terms of arc of prosperity, I think that's very much still on the agenda. If you look at the recovery from the downturn, Ireland and Iceland recovered much, much faster than the UK by virtue of the fact that they are small, easily managed economies. Both of them are now again got GDPs per head significantly higher than that of the UK. And just to come back on the numbers, Catherine's very selective on her quoting of the numbers. Scotland does have a deficit. It's got a deficit of 7 billion, which is about 5% of GDP. The UK has a deficit of 121 billion, which is about 8% of GDP. So Scotland's in a much better financial position than the UK. The OECD average deficit is about 6.5% of GDP. So it's very disingenuous to float this thing about Scotland not being able to pay its way in the world. Scotland's in a much better position to pay its way in the world than any other country in the West, with the exception of Norway, pretty much. And that tells you something else, because they've had the opportunity to manage their own resources over the last 30 or 40 years that Scotland hasn't had. And when Steve talks about social problems in West Central Scotland, Catherine, that's a function of what the Union's done for West Central Scotland. And if you're proud of that, I think
sorry,
you want to
Ivan,
have
I have
another
somebody
think
from
about
North
it.
Lanarkshire. I'm not taking that from you.
Go on, Catherine, come back.
I'm sorry, I come from Wishaw in North Lanarkshire. I now live in Fife. I think that the fact that to blame the Union on the social problems about deindustrialisation that have happened in West Central Scotland, the challenge that they face, to think that independence is going to solve all those problems. I'm sorry, Ivan, I don't know what world you live in, but it's somewhere...
Planet Norway.
About reality.
Well,
I'm sorry, but you just said you support a 3% reduction in corporation tax, but we want Norwegian social policy. I think somehow we've got to kind of square this circle. And I think at the moment you're selling a pipe dream.
We are nearly running out of time, so I do want to get back to Andrew Hughes Hallett and ask, are you satisfied with the overall sort of tenor of the debate, the public debate about economics, about the business case here? Because as we've seen here, there is a tendency to descend into a polarized view of where you happen to be on the debate. But in terms of the general debate about economics, are you satisfied that debate is being had seriously enough?
Yeah, I would emphasize what I said earlier, that the important thing here is to look at what is feasible rather than to advocate a particular position. 2 points on the last part, which has rather descended into a little bit shrill arguments. The first thing is on the numbers, and whether they add up, you have to take into account what revenues and spending would be available to Scotland if it were independent, as opposed to projecting onto Scotland what is being done at the moment, which is quite different. And so if you use one set of accounts which come out of London, you would find that certain things are being categorized as UK revenues and spending, which would actually return to Scotland. And that you'll find makes a much more evenly balanced, if not favourable, fiscal position. And any shortfalls which exist at the moment, for example, would get wiped out by the debt deal we talked about earlier. And the second thing to bear in mind is there's no point in projecting what you think the position might be, and be unfavourable perhaps for some people, based on the current policies. The whole point of independence is you get to use your own policies the way you want afterwards. So in that sense, it's likely to be much more favourable. It does, of course, depend what you decide to do. And just as a proposition, if you make a country of a decent size independent, it gets a lot more policy instruments which it can use for its own purposes as it sees fit. And so, by definition, they must be able to do better, because if nothing else, they could always use the instruments exactly as they've been used before and get the same outcomes. So, in that sense, it must be better. The only reason you wouldn't do that is if it caused unfortunate spillovers on other people, which then invited retaliation, or if you got diseconomies of scale. That's to say, as you get smaller, it becomes more expensive to do things. But you know from other countries of comparable sizes in this context that hasn't happened. So the possibility for Scotland to do better on an economic front would be better. I don't know if that answers the question without getting down into the nitty-gritty of particular positions and particular numbers.
I think it does, and I think that's a good place to end, given also that we've run out of time. But thank you all very much for what was a very lively discussion on the economics of Scottish independence. My thanks to my guests, Dr. Steve Davies, Petros Fasoulas, Catherine Staylor, Ivan McKee, and Andrew Hughes Hallett. You're listening to Radio VoR, the voice of Russia in London. Stay tuned.
The fact that Scotland is a wealthy country, and it will generate a new lease of life and opportunities for business investment following the yes vote this year. And there was a Ernst & Young report came out last year. Scotland yet again was the second highest area in the UK after London for inward investment, and that level had increased on the previous year. And the Ernst & Young report made the point of saying that was actually the fact that there was a referendum it wasn't hampering investment, it was actually encouraging it.
When we look at essentially how to sort of calculate the cost of divorce, which is essentially really what we're looking at in this debate, the UK government came out and said it would in all circumstances honour all UK debt. Andrew? You're listening to Radio VoR, the voice of Russia from London. Later this year, voters in Scotland will face something of an existential question, to be or not to be, an independent state, that is. Alex Salmonds' governing Scottish National Party, in what might be described as the longest referendum campaign in history, has been making its case for independence. The Better Together campaign, including Conservatives, Liberal Democrats and Labour, among others, have been making their case against. And in the run-up to that vote, Radio VoR is holding a series of discussions examining some of the key arguments in the debate. Today, we're looking at the business and economic case with a panel of experts, looking not so much at what the SNP or the Better Together campaigns say, but rather how their claims stand up. What would the impact of a yes vote for independence be on Scotland's economy and those of the UK and the EU? I'm joined here in the studio in London by Dr. Steve Davies. He's the Education Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Petros Fasoulas is Chairman of the European Movement UK, or Euromove. From Brussels, I'm joined by Catherine Staylor. She's a Labour MEP for Scotland. From Edinburgh, Ivan McKee is Director of Business for Scotland. He joins the discussion from there. Andrew Hughes Hallett is Professor of Economics at the University of St Andrews. He's also on the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisors. Welcome to you all. Clearly a lot to get through in this whole debate, but on this question of the economy,
I would give the Scottish Government greater powers to make its own decisions, adopt its own economic policies and things of that sort. But they haven't really, I think, spelt out what I think is actually quite a strong case on their side. They also haven't really addressed the, I think, very important question of monetary policy and whether or not Scotland should have its own currency after independence, which I think they probably should do, but that's something they've deliberately avoided addressing.
Currency, definitely one of the questions that we're going to get into in a bit more detail. But Ivan McKee, let me just come to you and ask you just generally, what impact is the independence debate having on business and investor confidence in Scotland?
I think that we've seen evidence that it's actually driving up the levels of inward investment into Scotland. A lot of people looking at this from outside Scotland and the UK recognise
I think this is one of the key things that is going to determine how this debate unfolds. Steve Davies, why don't we start with you? Has the Scottish Government, in its white paper on economics and in the general candour of the debate about what they've said about economics, have they made the case?
Well, they have in a way, but I think they've left a lot out. In fact, I think things that would redound to their benefit, actually. I do think that Scottish independence would benefit Scotland economically, but mainly because it would force the Scottish Government, whichever party that might be, to confront problems that they are able to avoid so long as they're part of the United Kingdom, particularly the catastrophic social problems they have in Greater Glasgow, basically. And they haven't actually made that case. I mean, Alex Salmonds has made the general case, which I think is correct, that it